My wife came home late Monday morning and said, "I don't owe you an explanation." I didn't ask for one. I simply moved a folder across the table. She looked confused, until she read the first page. Then she quietly sat down without saying a word. If you want real, honest stories every single week, make sure you're subscribed to Vows Stories. Join us right now before we continue. My name doesn't matter for this story, but I'll tell you I'm 41 years old. I work as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm, and until that Monday morning in March, I would have told you my marriage was solid. Not perfect. Solid. The kind of solid you build over 11 years, through 2 job losses, 1 miscarriage, a flooded basement that cost us $9,000 we didn't have, and a mortgage that felt impossible until suddenly it didn't. Her name was Rachel in my head that whole week, though that's not her real name either. I'll just call her my wife. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue in our late 20s, back when I still had hair on top of my head and she still smoked the occasional cigarette when she was stressed. A habit she quit 2 years into our marriage without me even asking her to. What struck me first wasn't her looks, though she was and is beautiful in a quiet way, but the way she listened. She had this habit of tilting her head slightly when you talked, like she was trying to hear the sentence underneath the sentence. I fell for that tilt before I fell for anything else. I remember telling my brother back then that I'd met a woman who actually listened when I talked, instead of just waiting for her turn to speak, and he laughed at me and said I was setting the bar embarrassingly low. Maybe I was, but 11 years later I still believe that's a rare thing to find in another person. We got married in a small ceremony behind her aunt's house in the fall, string lights in the trees, a borrowed sound system that kept cutting out during the vows. Her father conspicuously absent from the guest list for reasons I understood only much later. We bought our first house 4 years in, a modest 3-bedroom with a leaky roof we fixed ourselves over 2 exhausting weekends. We tried for a baby for a while, lost one at 11 weeks, grieved quietly and separately in the way people do when they don't yet have the language for that kind of loss, and eventually made a kind of peace with it being just the 2 of us. And, for a while, a rescue dog named Biscuit, who lived to be 14 and died the January before all of this happened. I mention Biscuit because I think his absence that winter left a kind of quiet in the house that maybe made both of us more susceptible to secrets, more alone in our own heads than we should have been. For the past 4 months, though, something had shifted. It started small, the way these things always do, small enough that you can talk yourself out of noticing. She began taking calls in the bathroom with the fan running, which she'd never done before. She'd glance at her phone and then put it face down, quickly, almost involuntarily, like she'd been caught at something even when I hadn't said a word or even looked her way. She started going to a book club on Thursday nights that I had never once heard mentioned before January, and when I asked what they were reading, she gave me a title I later discovered, when I finally worked up the nerve to search it online at 2 in the morning, didn't exist. And her hours at the marketing agency where she worked, hours that used to be predictable 9 to 5 with the occasional Tuesday deadline crunch, started stretching into the evening, sometimes past 9, sometimes past 10, with explanations that felt thinner each time. A client emergency, a pitch deck due at dawn, a co-worker's flat tire that somehow required her personal assistance for 2 hours. I want to be honest with you about something because this story only works if I am. I am not a paranoid man by nature. I don't check phones. I don't scroll through call logs. I grew up in a house where my father did that to my mother, relentlessly, obsessively, accusing her of affairs with the mailman, with her own brother-in-law, with a checkout clerk at the grocery store, whose only crime was being polite to her once in front of my father. I watched what that did to my mother over the years, the way she started flinching before answering simple questions, the way joy slowly drained out of her like water out of a cracked vase. I swore, somewhere around 15 years old, standing in the hallway listening to another one of those screaming matches through my bedroom wall, that I would never become that kind of husband. So for months, I said nothing. I told myself it was stress, new account at work, budget season, grief over Biscuit that she hadn't fully processed. The kind of explanations we give ourselves because the alternative is too frightening to sit with directly. But there's a particular kind of silence that isn't peace, it's just fear wearing peace's clothing. And by February, I wasn't sleeping well. I'd lie awake next to her, listening to her breathing, running through a mental list of every strange detail from the past weeks, building a case in my head even while telling myself I wasn't the kind of man who builds cases against his wife. I hated who I was becoming in those quiet hours, and I hated more that I didn't know how to stop it. The withdrawals were what finally broke something loose in me. I noticed them by accident in early February while reconciling our joint checking account for taxes, something I usually handle since I'm the numbers person in the relationship. 4 withdrawals of exactly $900 each, spaced roughly a week apart, all made on Thursday afternoons, all in cash, no memo, nothing. $900 is a specific number, not 1,000, which would trip a bank's automatic reporting threshold in some cases. 900 felt deliberate, felt like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't want it noticed. I didn't ask her about it. I know how that sounds now, looking back, but at the time it felt like the only rational choice available to a man raised by my father. If I asked and she lied, I'd have no way of knowing. If I asked and she told the truth, and the truth was what I feared, I'd have handed her the chance to prepare a story before I had any leverage at all. So instead, in a decision I'm still not entirely proud of, I hired a private investigator. His name was Mitchell, a retired cop in his 60s who worked out of a strip mall office above a nail salon, and he charged me $450 for 2 weeks of intermittent surveillance, mostly just tracking her movements on the Thursdays when the withdrawals happened. The first report came back with nothing dramatic. She'd gone to a pharmacy, then a grocery store, then sat in her car in a parking lot for 40 minutes on the phone, according to Mitchell's notes, before driving home. The second week was similar, except this time she'd driven out toward the edge of town, toward an area I didn't recognize, and stopped at a motel called the Blue Spruce Inn for just under an hour before driving home again. I remember reading that line in Mitchell's typed report, sitting in my car in the parking lot of my own office building and feeling something in my chest drop straight through the floor of me. A motel, cash withdrawals, secret phone calls, late nights with a book club that didn't exist. My mind, trained by years of silent worry, assembled the pieces into the only story it knew how to tell. An affair. A slow, deliberate unraveling of 11 years, happening right under my nose while I sat at home telling myself I was being paranoid. That same week, by accident, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. I want to be clear that I didn't go looking. I was refilling my coffee, and the screen simply lit up beside me, a text preview visible for the few seconds before it dimmed again. A name I didn't recognize. Daniel. The message read something like, "Same time Thursday?" And underneath it, a second message that had come in moments before, "Don't tell him yet, okay?" I stood there staring at that screen until it went dark on its own, and something in me went very quiet and very cold. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't confront her the next night either. Instead, I spent the following weeks gathering more, the way you gather evidence for a trial you're terrified of losing. I found a receipt from the Blue Spruce Inn stuffed at the bottom of her gym bag while looking, genuinely, for my car keys, which she'd apparently borrowed one afternoon while her own car was in the shop. Dated 3 weeks earlier. I photographed it with my phone and put it back exactly where I'd found it, folded the same way, tucked under the same water bottle. By early March, I had built an entire case file in a plain manila folder that I kept hidden in the bottom drawer of my home office desk, underneath old tax returns from a decade ago that neither of us would ever have a reason to dig through. The bank statement with the 4 highlighted withdrawals, a printed screenshot of the text exchange, the little I'd managed to see and remember accurately enough to reconstruct, the motel receipt, Mitchell's 2 typed surveillance reports. I told myself I was gathering proof so that when I finally did confront her, I would be standing on solid ground instead of accusations she could talk her way around, the way my father used to fling wild accusations at my mother with nothing behind them but his own insecurity. I told myself I was being careful, being fair, being the opposite of him. What I didn't account for was how much that 6 weeks of silent surveillance was costing me on the inside. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. I stopped sleeping through the night. At work, my supervisor pulled me aside twice to ask if everything was all right, because I'd missed 2 deadlines that I'd never missed in 6 years there. I started rehearsing conversations with her in my head while driving, entire arguments and confrontations that I never actually had, because every time I got close to saying something out loud, that old fear would rise up in my throat and choke the words before they could leave. Then came that Monday. I remember the light in the kitchen that morning, gray and flat. The kind of March light that makes Ohio look like it's been drained of color entirely, like someone left the saturation dial turned all the way down overnight. I was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm because I'd been sitting there for almost 2 hours, not moving, just waiting, the manila folder resting on the chair beside me like a silent third guest at the table. She'd texted the night before that she was staying at her sister's after a work thing ran late. Her sister, when I called at 11:30 out of a fear I couldn't quite name, said she hadn't heard from her all week and sounded genuinely confused as to why I was asking. That phone call with her sister was, in some ways, the moment everything tipped over for me. If she'd lied about where she was going, actually lied, using her own sister as an alibi without her sister's knowledge, then whatever I feared wasn't just possible anymore. It felt confirmed. I didn't sleep a single minute after that call. I sat in the living room in the dark, and then eventually at the kitchen table, watching the window slowly go from black to that flat gray, listening for the sound of her car in the driveway, rehearsing one final time what I would say, and, more importantly, what I would show her. She walked in at 7:42 in the morning. I know because I looked at the microwave clock the second I heard her key turn in the lock. She was still in yesterday's clothes, a green blouse I'd bought her for her birthday 2 years earlier, now wrinkled badly at the collar and the sleeves. Her hair was down instead of pulled back into the tight bun she always wears to work, and there were faint shadows under her eyes that told me she hadn't slept much either, wherever she'd been. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me sitting there, coffee cup in front of me, folder resting on the chair. "You're up early?" she said, and there was something guarded in her voice already, something that told me she knew this wasn't going to be a normal morning. "I didn't sleep," I said. She set her purse down on the counter, slow, deliberate, like she was buying herself time to construct something. I watched her eyes flick toward the folder on the chair and then quickly away, and I remember thinking, in that moment, that the flicker of her eyes was confirmation enough on its own. And then she said the sentence that has been living in my chest ever since, the sentence I've replayed more times than I can count. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said. "I want you to sit with that for a second the way I had to sit with it. 11 years of marriage, and the woman across from me had apparently decided that a night away from home, with a fabricated cover story told to her own sister, required no accounting whatsoever. I felt something in me go very still and very cold, the way I imagine people feel right before they do something they can't take back. But here's the thing. I didn't yell. I didn't ask where she'd been. I'd spent the last 6 weeks preparing for this exact moment, and yelling wasn't part of any version of the plan I'd rehearsed. I reached over, picked up the plain manila folder, and slid it across the kitchen table toward her. It made a soft scraping sound against the wood, the only sound in the room besides the refrigerator humming and, somewhere far off, a garbage truck beginning its Monday rounds 2 or 3 streets over. She looked at it like it might be a trick, her eyes moving from the folder to my face and back again. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, almost like it belonged to someone else. She hesitated for a long moment, then pulled out the chair across from me, sat down slowly, and opened the folder. This is where things take a turn. What would you have assumed at this point? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Now let me tell you what was actually in that folder, laid out in the order I'd arranged it, because I think you deserve to know exactly what I knew at that moment, sitting there with my cold coffee, watching my wife's face for a reaction I'd been dreading for 6 weeks. The first page was the printed bank statement, the 4 withdrawals of exactly $900 circled in red pen, each one dated on a Thursday. The second page was my best written reconstruction of the text message I'd glimpsed, the name Daniel typed at the top, the words, "Same time Thursday," and "Don't tell him yet" beneath it. The third page was a photograph I'd taken of the motel receipt from the Blue Spruce Inn, time-stamped, dated 3 weeks earlier. Behind that were Mitchell's 2 surveillance reports, typed on his letterhead, describing her movements on those 2 Thursdays in clinical, dispassionate detail, the kind of detail that made my stomach turn even as I'd read it the first time in my car. I watched her read the first page. Her hand, I noticed, had started to shake slightly, the paper trembling just enough to catch the gray morning light coming through the kitchen window. She turned to the second page and went very pale, pale in a way I'd never seen on her before, not even during the miscarriage, not even at her own father's funeral, which she hadn't wanted to attend but did anyway out of some obligation to her mother. And then, just like the title of this whole ordeal suggests, she read further, and she sat down deeper into the chair, not dramatically, not with a gasp or a sob, but the way someone sits when their legs have quietly, involuntarily stopped agreeing to hold them up any longer. "Where did you get this?" she said. It wasn't really a question, not the way she said it. Her voice had gone completely flat, stripped of anything but exhaustion. "I've known something was going on since January," I said, keeping my own voice as level as I could manage, though my hands were shaking too, hidden under the table where she couldn't see them. "I didn't want to accuse you of anything until I actually had something real. I hired someone, a private investigator. His name is Mitchell. I know how that sounds and I'm not proud of it, but I didn't know what else to do." She looked up at me then, and I braced myself, genuinely, physically braced myself, every muscle in my shoulders tightening, for confirmation. For the sentence that would end the marriage, the sentence I'd been rehearsing my own response to for 6 sleepless weeks. Instead, she started crying, but not the way I expected. It wasn't guilty crying, the kind that comes with excuses and half-truths tumbling out in a panic. It was the kind of crying that comes from somewhere much older and much more tired, a kind of crying that had clearly been building for months, maybe longer than the months I'd been suspicious. "His name is Daniel," she said, her voice cracking on the second syllable of his name. "He's my half-brother." I sat there blinking at her like she'd spoken in a different language entirely, the word brother refusing to fit into any of the sentences I'd been preparing myself to hear. "I found him in December," she continued, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing what little makeup she'd had on from the day before. "Through one of those ancestry sites, the kind you spit into a tube and mail off. My dad, before he left when I was 6, apparently had another family down in Kentucky that none of us ever knew existed. My mom certainly never knew. Or if she did, she never said a word about it to me or my sister. Daniel is 34. He's been in and out of rehab twice, once for pills and once for alcohol, and when I found him he had nothing left. No steady job, a car that hadn't run in 2 months, a landlord threatening eviction, and a 9-year-old daughter named Callie that he was fighting to get custody of, because her mother's own situation had gotten unstable too. I remember my mouth going completely dry, the words barely able to form. "The withdrawals," I managed to say. "I was helping him," she said, her voice small now, almost childlike in its shame. $900 a week because that's what I could pull without it showing up as one enormous red flag on our joint statement, because I was ashamed, because I genuinely did not know how to look at you and say, "By the way, I have a secret half-brother down in Kentucky who's basically drowning, and I've been sending him money since January without telling you." I kept telling myself I'd bring it up when the timing felt right, and the timing never felt right, and the longer I waited, the more impossible it felt to say anything at all. "The motel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper now, the folder still sitting open on the table between us like an accusation neither of us wanted to touch anymore. "That's where he was staying," she said. "The Blue Spruce, because it was cheap and it took cash and didn't ask questions about credit checks the way an apartment would. I went there 3 times to bring him groceries and to see Callie because his ex-girlfriend was letting me see her some weekends, since I'm basically the only stable family member stepping up right now. I borrowed your car that 1 week because mine was in the shop for a bad alternator, and I didn't want to have to explain a 40-minute round trip out to a motel to my own husband over what I'd have had to admit was a rental car receipt. And the text," I said, feeling something in my chest starting to unclench, slowly, painfully, like a fist that had been closed too long. "Don't tell him yet." She let out a small, broken laugh that had almost no humor in it at all. "I meant you," she said. "I wasn't ready to tell you I had a brother I'd been keeping secret for 3 months, because I didn't know how to explain why I'd hidden something that big for so long without you thinking I'd been lying to you about something worse. And every week that passed made the secret feel bigger and more impossible to bring up, until it felt like this enormous wall between us that I'd built one silent brick at a time. I sat there in that gray kitchen light with the folder open between us, the pages slightly damp now where her tears had fallen on the corner of one, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with relief and nothing to do with anger. It was something closer to grief. Grief for the 6 weeks I'd spent building a case against my own wife instead of asking her a single honest question across this same table. Grief for the $450 I'd paid a stranger named Mitchell to follow the woman I loved because I was too afraid of becoming my father to simply say, out loud, "Something feels different lately. Can we talk about it?" "Where were you last night?" I asked, quieter now, some of the coldness having drained out of my voice entirely. "Callie had a school thing," she said, still crying but steadier now, like the worst of it had passed through her. "A father-daughter dance last night that Daniel couldn't take her to, because he doesn't have custody yet, and things got complicated with his ex about pickup times and who was legally allowed to sign her out of the school building. I didn't want her to be the only kid there without someone, so I went. I ended up staying over on Daniel's couch because it was already past 11, and I didn't want to drive back that far half asleep. I should have called you. I should have told you where I was going instead of lying to my own sister about a work thing. And I should have told you about Daniel 3 months ago instead of letting it become this. I was a coward about it, and I'm sorry, and I don't know what else to say except that I'm sorry. We sat in that kitchen for close to 2 hours after that, the coffee finally growing cold enough that I got up and made a fresh pot without either of us saying much for a while. Just the sound of the coffee maker gurgling and the occasional car passing by outside on the street. Eventually, she told me everything, start to finish, the whole story about her father's other life, about finding Daniel's profile on the Ancestry site at 11 at night back in December and staring at his profile photo for 20 minutes because he had her mother's eyes, the same slight downturn at the corners that she has too. She told me about the fear that if she told me, I'd think she was inviting chaos into our carefully rebuilt life, addiction and custody battles and instability, right when we'd finally gotten stable enough to breathe. I told her about the folder in return, about the 6 weeks of watching her phone light up and saying nothing, about Mitchell, whose name I won't dwell on further out of respect for the fact that he was just doing a job I asked him to do, even if that job now sits in my memory like a small personal failure I'll carry for a while. I told her about my father, about the screaming matches through the bedroom wall, about the way I'd spent our entire marriage terrified of becoming him, so terrified that I'd swung all the way to the opposite extreme, saying absolutely nothing at all until I'd built an entire secret investigation instead of simply asking, "Are you okay? You seem far away lately and I miss you." She reached across the table at one point and took my hand, her fingers cold from having been wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't really drinking from, and neither of us said anything for a while. The refrigerator kept humming. Somewhere outside, the garbage truck finished its slow, groaning route down our street, and a neighbor's dog barked twice and then went quiet. "I want to meet him," I said eventually, once the silence had settled into something more comfortable than painful. "Daniel and Callie." She looked at me like I'd offered her something she hadn't let herself hope for, her eyes still red-rimmed, but something like relief starting to break through the exhaustion on her face. "You'd do that?" she asked. "After everything I put you through this week?" "He's your brother," I said. "That makes him something to me too, even if I don't know what yet. And you didn't put me through this by yourself. I built half of this mess with my own 2 hands, in the dark, without ever giving you the chance to explain." That was 5 months ago now. I'm telling you this story on a Sunday evening in August, and quite a few things have changed since that Monday morning in the kitchen with the gray light and the manila folder. Daniel got custody of Callie in May after a longer and more grueling process than any of us expected. It wasn't easy. There were 2 more court dates, a caseworker who visited his new apartment twice with a clipboard and a face that gave nothing away, and 1 relapse scare in April that had all of us holding our breath for the better part of a week. My wife driving out to Kentucky twice in 3 days without telling anyone at her job the real reason. But he's 15 months sober now as of this recording, working steadily at a warehouse about 20 minutes from us after he and Callie relocated closer to where we live. And Callie stays with us every other weekend because his shift schedule doesn't always line up neatly with her school pickup times. She's 9 years old, she likes to draw horses with an almost frightening level of detail for her age, and she calls me uncle now, which still catches me off guard every single time in a way that warms something in my chest I didn't know needed warming. My wife and I started seeing a marriage counselor about a month after that Monday morning, not because our marriage was fundamentally broken, but because we both agreed, sitting at that same kitchen table a few nights later, that we needed to relearn how to talk to each other before small silences turned into 6-week secret investigations again. It's been useful, more useful than I expected going in, since I'd always privately thought counseling was for marriages already circling the drain. I've learned, through a lot of uncomfortable Tuesday evening sessions, that my instinct to go quiet and gather evidence instead of asking a direct question is a habit I inherited from watching my father do the exact opposite so loudly and so wrongly that I built the mirror version of his mistake without ever realizing it. Silence can be just as corrosive as shouting. I'm working on it, slowly. Some Thursdays, I still catch myself watching her phone a little too closely out of old habit, and I've learned to just say it out loud instead of storing it away in some mental folder. I noticed you seem distracted lately. Is everything okay? It's a small sentence. It costs almost nothing to say out loud. I wish I'd learned that 11 years ago instead of 6 weeks before everything nearly fell apart. As for Mitchell's reports and the rest of that folder, I kept them. Not out of anger, and not because I need reminding of what I did, but as a kind of quiet marker. They sit in a drawer in my home office now, underneath a newer stack of paperwork, and every so often, when I'm frustrated about something small, a dish left in the sink overnight, a canceled dinner plan, a short answer to a text that I could easily read 3 different ways, I open that drawer and remember how close I came to destroying something real over a story I told myself alone in the dark. A story that had almost nothing to do with the actual truth sitting right in front of me the whole time. My wife framed a photo of her, Daniel and Callie, taken this past 4th of July, all 3 of them squinting into the afternoon sun at a lake about an hour from our house. Callie holding up a fish she'd apparently caught herself with more pride than the fish probably deserved. It sits on our mantel now, right next to our wedding photo from that backyard ceremony with the string lights and the sound system that kept cutting out. 2 very different kinds of family, sitting side by side on the same shelf. Both of them earned the hard way through mistakes and silence and finally, eventually, the truth. I think about that Monday morning a lot, probably more than is strictly healthy. The folder sliding across the table, the soft scraping sound of it against the wood, the way her face changed from confusion to fear to something quieter and sadder as she understood what I'd done and why I'd done it. I don't think either of us handled those months perfectly, not even close. She kept a real secret for far too long, out of shame and fear of how I'd react, and I let my own fear curdle into surveillance instead of a simple, honest conversation, the very thing I'd sworn as a teenager I would never do to someone I loved. But I've come to believe, 5 months and a lot of counseling sessions later, that a marriage isn't really tested by the mistakes you make along the way. Every marriage makes them in one form or another. It's tested by what you're both willing to sit at a kitchen table and rebuild afterward, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, even when the light coming through the window is flat and gray and neither of you slept the night before. We're okay now. Better than okay, most days, in a way that feels earned rather than assumed. And every other Friday evening, when Daniel drops Callie off at our door with her backpack and her rolled-up stack of horse drawings, and my wife hugs her brother goodbye on our front porch while the porch light flickers on against the coming dark, I think about how close I came to burning down something real because I was too afraid to just ask a simple question out loud, 6 weeks earlier than I finally did. Did this ending turn out the way you expected? Comment below and tell me what scenario we should cover in the next video.